What's up, everyone? So if you are a V0 to V4 climber and you're looking to improve your climbing, here's one very important area that you need to train, and that is power. Why is power so important? Well, it helps us to express our strength, and power helps us with those big cruxy moves, especially with dead points, dynos, and any kind of movement on overhanging terrain. And from a longevity perspective, having good power will help us live a higher quality of life. And for us climbers, it will help us climb longer in the sport that we absolutely love. And I love talking about power. I personally work on power all of the time, and it's a really big part of my own programming and for all of my programming for my clients. So, in fact, right now in our membership, we are focused heavily on power. So, we're using power training as a transition period between performance phases. All right, so in today's episode, I'm going to cover what power is, why climbers should be focusing on it, which exercises to do specifically for climbers, and especially for those who are climbing in the V0 to V4 range or the 510 to 511 plus range, and why it's important for longevity and particularly for women. So we'll also talk about some of the mental strategies that we can use to continue our power development. All right, so let's get into it. So what is power in just general athletics? Well, a simple definition is that power equals force times velocity. Really, velocity is just another way of saying speed. So let's use strength as kind of the comparison. So strength is the ability to produce as much force as possible, no matter how long it takes. Whereas power is the ability to exert force in regards to speed. So it basically combines strength and speed. This means that power can be created with very different combinations. So hypothetically, you can produce the same amount of power by relying more on force and less on speed. For example, power lifters or folks who do strongman sports. You can also rely less on force development and more on speed, such as sprinters, jumpers, and throwers. Or you can have a balance of both force development and speed development. And usually this is Olympic lifters or other throwing athletes. So thinking about this, where do you think climbers fall on the spectrum when it comes to power? Well, I would say that we are much closer to sprinters and jumpers because really we're using our body weight to overcome gravity. But one caveat is that our terrains are so variable. So we transition from vertical to overhanging terrain, and this changes the amount of body weight that we are organizing and managing in order to make these moves. So we're often faced with a change in how much weight we are manipulating against gravity. So I think really we are somewhere in between an Olympic lifter and a sprinter. And being powerful doesn't necessarily mean that you are explosive. You can have power without being explosive. So, in order to be explosive, which is what we're really looking for as climbers, you have to rely on producing power from the speed aspect, creating more velocity, which is what coaches call the rate of force development. And this is how quickly someone can generate force. So, in other words, this is explosive power. So, the amount of power that we can develop is largely determined by genetics. It often comes down to the number of fast twitch muscle fibers that we have, or type 1 fast twitch muscle fibers. And some people have a head start in this. Some of us have to work really hard in order to develop the ones that we have. You can't really change the amount of fast twitch muscle fibers that you have, but you can increase the strength or the connection of those fast twitch muscle fibers. So for climbers, what we're really going to try to do is leverage this power training to our advantage. And something to consider, the brain and muscle connection plays a really huge part in this too. And this is called neuromuscular efficiency. This is where we can make really big strides in our power development without having to rely solely on our genetic component. Some other things that we might need are tendon stiffness. The more stored energy that we can use in our tendons, the better. Another genetic component is actually our limb length. So depending on the sport that we're playing, leverage is going to play a huge part in how much power we can develop. So don't get discouraged by the genetic component if you're not quite the person who has a lot of fast twitch muscle fibers or the right limb length. That's totally okay. We can easily use targeted power training to increase our explosive strength, no matter where we are as athletes. Now, the thing is that the first part of the power equation is force development, how much force we can create. And this comes down largely to how strong we are. And we can train this easily by doing bench press, squatting, deadlifts, things of that nature, and really trying to lift as heavy as possible and making sure that we are progressing those loads over time. And you can increase your speed. And this is what we're about to talk about in this podcast. So, what is power in a climbing specific context? Well, it's again the ability to generate force as quickly as possible to generate momentum, especially when there's not a lot of support from the feet. Let's say you're on very, very small feet and you need to make a really big move. So a very easy way to see power in climbing is in a dyno or a run and jump. But I would say that power is consistently in our climbing, but it's very subtle. Anytime that you're not being static, you're most likely relying on power or trying to be dynamic. So for example, when there are slightly bigger moves, you're probably using power. When you need to accurately latch onto a hold, a handhold, that's also using power. And as well as climbing on overhanging terrain. Usually, most of us are not strong enough to climb statically on overhanging terrain, so we have to use some power in order to get to the next move. We'll also see power being used anytime that you're trying to catch a hold or hold onto a hold as you're falling off, or even just as your feet are cutting. We're going to be using some dynamic tension in our body. Now, I've come up with 4 phases of a move, a powerful move in climbing. And this is something that I have taken from Olympic lifting. So this is not like a textbook definition of 4 phases of power in climbing. But I think it's fairly accurate. So in the first part of any climbing movement where we're being dynamic, we use a counter movement phase. This is essentially where the body is moving in the opposite direction of the target hold. This starts the stored elastic energy in the tendons, and you can think of this as putting a stretch on a rubber band before you shoot it off. The second phase is the fast pull phase. This is where you're generating enough force to hit the height of the next hold. Then there's the contact phase. This is where you're dead pointing. It's a perfection of timing and accuracy of your fingers, making the shape of the hold as fast as possible. Then the last phase, which is the catching and absorption phase. This is where you're absorbing the force that you just generated. You can think of this as like catching an egg. So if someone threw you an egg, you're going to have to catch that egg and absorb the movement or the momentum so that you don't break the egg. So all of these phases need power in order to execute it really well. So how do we train power generally? So if we're not looking at a climbing context and we just want to build a powerful body, then in general, we want to be working on moves or at an intensity that is between 30 to 70% of your 1 rep max. Now you can train more than this percentage or less than this percentage, but generally somewhere in between is good enough. Now you can use any combination of intensity and speed. So for climbers, it's not about lifting the heaviest weight. It's about the amount of speed that we can produce with light to moderate loads. And Olympic lifters, to put in context, Olympic lifters generally use about 55% of their 1 rep max or more. Sprinters and throwers will use their body weight to overcome gravity, and they have been known to actually use an assist to help them coordinate their power. And this is called overspeed training. Power training often involves medicine balls, like medicine ball throws, Olympic lifts, plyometrics, and ballistics. A little bit of strength and conditioning history here. And I am having a really hard time saying this guy's name. Yuri Verkhoshansky. I am so sorry. I should just be fired right now. So he actually came up with what we know as plyometrics. He basically figured out that you can be really explosive when you take advantage of stored elastic energy, specifically in your tendons. And this is called the stretch shortening cycle. And you do this by quickly transitioning between a concentric phase and an eccentric phase in a movement. So, for example, a depth jump. You jump from a box to the ground, and then you try to jump off the ground. And that ground contact time is really what we're focusing on. And the shorter amount of time that you can be on the ground, the more that you can take advantage of the stored elastic energy. So that's really what became plyometric training, or what was first known as the shock method. And it's really decreasing this amount of time between those jumps. And this became so popular, really, it was like the main part of the Soviet strength training model. And it became super, super popular. And the most well-known exercise is the depth jump that came out of this research. And really, again, it's jumping off of a box onto the ground and then jumping up as high as you can. There are many ways of training plyometrics. You can just do a box jump where you jump from the ground up onto the box, but your intent is to move explosively as possible. Bounding, I love bounding. This is an exercise that I put into many clients' programs because it's very easily accessible. You can do triple jumps with a single leg or any kind of single leg bounding variation. Plyometrics does need to have a substantial amount of strength foundation before getting into some of these bigger depth jumps. So what I don't want you to do after this podcast is to go and do a depth jump. In some of the research, it's been shown that if you're going to be doing a depth jump, I think it's more than 12 inches down onto the ground and then back up, that you need to be able to squat around double or even triple your body weight. So just keep that in context. Anytime that you're jumping down from a box and then trying to explode up, we are putting so much force into our legs and our knees as we're making contact with the ground, that we really have to have the strength to overcome that and to manage that kind of force. So just keep that in mind. Another very accessible exercise that makes you very, very explosive is sprinting. This is something that I do for myself, especially as a woman. I want to be able to do a lot of high intensity training, and I can combine sprinting with HIIT training. So I'm getting explosive work, plus I'm working that energy system. Because in general, women lack kind of that higher intensity, like the fast twitch muscle fibers. We don't have as many as men do. So it's important for us to really focus on this energy system as well. So sprinting, if you like to sprint, you should definitely give that a go. Again, you should probably know how to run well before you just go right ahead into sprinting. So one thing about any of this training is that you really want quality over quantity. In general, fatigue is the thief of power. So if you're going in and you're not giving 100% to every rep, you're not going to get very much out of it. So once you see a decline in your power, stop the set or stop the rep, okay? And you want to rest longer between these sets and reps. Generally, I like 1 rep at a time, giving yourself a lot of time between reps. Sometimes that can be 5 to 10 seconds, depending on the exercise. It could even be minutes between each rep. But just make sure that you're recovering really well. And the higher the intensity, the lower your reps and sets are going to be. So make sure that you're constantly keeping track of this. One caveat of some of this power training is that it does take a while to master. For example, like Olympic lifts, they're actually amazing, amazing exercises for developing explosive strength. But the amount of time that it takes to learn these Olympic lifts, like a clean or a clean and jerk or a snatch, these are all very skill dependent exercises. So you can definitely work on learning those exercises, but in the meantime, you can use exercises that are going to be a little less intense and a little bit more accessible, especially if you're an older adult who hasn't trained a lot, or if you're a new trainee in general, no matter what your age is. And these accessible exercises are in the category of what we call ballistics. And you can do ballistics as a pulling exercise, a throwing exercise, a jumping exercise. Ballistics are useful for athletes who rely heavily on high speed movements, such as sprinters and jumpers and climbers. So it's definitely more accessible because it also lowers your risk of injury. And you can go back to one of my most recent podcasts all about jump training. I think that jump roping is definitely one of the more accessible jumping exercises that we can do. Plus, there is a metabolic component to it. Some other ballistic exercises could be like power pulls, ball throws, ball slams, kettlebell swings, sled pulls, things like that. So, where there's not necessarily a big load that you're having to manage, but these exercises are specifically designed for you to move as explosively as possible. And currently in our training membership, we are doing box jumps, we're doing some kettlebell swings, we're doing medicine ball throws. And for the most part, we're keeping those sets and reps pretty low because the intent of moving explosively is really high. So we're doing about 3 to 5 sets of 3 to 8 reps with plenty of rest in between. Now, a common mistake that I often see in climbers is that they go too hard or too much volume. And again, like the difficulty does not necessarily mean that you're actually working explosiveness. Sure, you might be working power, but you're not working that explosive component. And really for us, it's all about the speed at which we're moving. So just keep that in mind. If it feels too hard, you might be doing it wrong. If it feels snappy and easy, you're probably doing it right. So how do we train power specifically for climbing? And really my favorite drill is the jump and catch drill. And you can do this on a regular climbing wall in the gym. You can do this on a spray wall. You can do this on a training wall. And you can easily scale this to any ability. And really the intention is to catch a hold with a bent arm. And you can also do this with a foot on if you like. Your foot doesn't have to cut, but really the goal is to build muscle recruitment in that position. You're going to improve your contact strength between the fingers and the handhold. You're going to improve your reactive strength. So that means coordinating your whole body in order to be able to latch that hold and to hold on to that with good body tension. You're going to improve your timing and your dead pointing ability, as well as just general coordination. Another exercise would be foot on campusing. Now, most people will think that campusing really should be done without feet. And that's really what campusing, the definition of campusing is without feet. But a campus board generally has very small handholds on it. And real true campusing and campus boarding really should be left to the advanced climbers. They are generally strong enough to maintain good body tension, good body position, good shoulder position, and they have enough finger strength in order to pull fast on a smaller edge and be able to latch a hold. So if you're just getting started, please don't go to a campus board and just start campusing. You can try campusing on jugs. Like that could be really fun, especially on overhanging, and you can get your friends involved. Just make sure that you're keeping the total volume low. All right. You're just doing a couple moves at a time and having some fun. You can also do no feet campusing on a training board and keeping the moves actually pretty small. You don't have to go for really big moves, especially in the beginning. If you're new to it, you can make smaller moves and get used to that coordination. But foot on campusing, if all you have is a campus board, then you can use your feet and you can just try to generate as much explosive movement as you're making that one arm move up to the next rung. Another exercise are drops onto a hangboard. And I like to use bigger edges for this. And it kind of lives in the same category as the foot on campusing. Just make sure that you are familiar with those edge sizes, that you're familiar with knowing how to hold onto an edge in a half crimp or a 3-finger drag. There is a lot of skill in just being able to use these tools first and foremost before you even start using these tools for these other exercises, such as this explosive work. So basically an edge drop onto a hangboard, you're putting your hands just above the handhold and you're dropping down and catching that edge with a lot of tension in your body. And again, you want your arms to be slightly bent. You want tension in your core and your legs as well. So this is really great for building finger strength, for improving contact strength. And you can kind of think of this as almost like a mini depth jump for your fingers. And then lastly, of course, you can work on dynos. This is where you're focusing more on power development through the legs, and your upper body is really working on absorbing that power. No matter what exercise that you're doing, again, just a reminder, make sure that you are resting enough between these efforts. Power really dies when you're fatigued. And this has been clearly shown in research that fatigue hinders your power development. So make sure you're feeling snappy and you give yourself enough time between those reps. So now let's talk about aging and longevity. So as we age, we don't just lose strength. Unfortunately, we're also losing power, and we're losing power at an even faster rate. So it declines more rapidly than just our absolute strength or even our endurance. And this has really huge implications for how we move, how we react, and how we perform. And this doesn't just include climbing. This is our general daily living. And especially for women, this is really important because hormonal changes do affect our muscle recruitment. So in peri or postmenopausal women, you'll experience this natural change in or flux in estrogen and testosterone. And of course, our other sex hormones. And all of these do support neuromuscular function. So power training can actually help with decreasing some of these side effects that we might be experiencing as we go through these phases of our life. Bone density has shown to increase rapidly with power training, especially with jump training, because there's so much load in those jumps. It's really going to improve the bone density. It puts a lot of stress on your bones, and especially for postmenopausal women, this is going to be really, really important to focus on. There is also a pretty strong correlation between power loss and the loss of independence later in the later stages of our life. Studies have really shown pretty clearly that a decrease in power is more predictive of falls. as well as function in older adults. So this really does highlight the importance of power training throughout your life. And then in general, if you like climbing now, you'll probably like climbing a lot later in life too. And so power training is going to help us be snappier, to feel really sharp, to feel strong, and also to feel safer as we make really big moves or dynamic moves. And one thing to keep in mind, maybe you didn't know this, but fast twitch muscle fibers atrophy first. It costs a lot to maintain the strength or the efficiency of power in our body. And so we have to constantly be training it in order to keep it up. But because it's expensive, it's kind of the first thing that our body chooses to not pay attention to if we stop training or if we just don't train at all. Really, those muscle fibers are going to be the first thing to go. So make sure that if you have parents who are aging, you can maybe help them with a little bit of power training. All right, so let's circle back to some common mistakes. I just want to really drill this home. Make sure that you are not doing exercises that are too intense. For example, campusing. If you can't do a pull-up or you can't hang from a hangboard for 20 seconds plus, you should not be doing campusing. Don't also do jug campusing with a weighted vest on. That is not going to help you to be more explosive. We want quick, fast movement. Once you get to a certain point of strength, then yeah, sure, maybe a weighted vest could help in your general climbing. But for most part, we want to be moving really, really well when we're executing these movements. Don't do too much volume. You will often find yourself not fatigued from power training, and that's good. A lot of what's happening in the body, all of the adaptations, is happening more at the brain and nerve level. So your muscles won't get fatigued. But once your muscles do get fatigued, that is a signal to say, hey, you're done with this set, you're done with this rep, and we're going to move on. All right, so make sure that you're keeping that in perspective. And really here, the more is definitely not better when it comes to power training. So let me give you some general numbers for rests. You want to rest at least a 1-to-4 ratio of work to rest. So if something takes you 10 seconds to do, you're going to rest at least 4 times that. So 40 seconds. I would actually say longer, especially for finger intensive power training. I would rest a lot longer between these sets. I generally do about 90 seconds between 2 to 4 moves of the jump and catch. You also want to keep the reps pretty low. So for the jump and catch, for example, you can do 2 moves at one time and then rest for 60 to 90 seconds, or you could do 4 to 6, depending on how trained you are. And again, once you notice that, okay, I'm not feeling as snappy on that rep, you'll just stop, okay? But make sure you're resting enough. All right, so when should power training be in your session? And really, it should always be at the front end of your session. After a really good warm-up, make sure that you are making the warm-up your own and that you feel ready for that power training. When you are fresh, that is when your nervous system is the most sharp and your movements can be really fast and clean. And because power training needs higher outputs in a very short amount of time, you need to be fresh and in a non-fatigued state. So that, again, your rest times need to be longer and you have to pay attention to how you feel each set. This can't be overstated. If it's at the end, you're really just moving with fatigue and you're not really developing power. So some mental strategies that you can use to improve your power, if you're not going to specifically do some of these power drills, then you can use some of these mental strategies. And something to consider is that the brain plays a really huge part in motor unit recruitment, meaning how many muscle fibers you can fire to help us move. And this is a signal that is sent from the brain through the spinal cord and down toward your targeted muscles. And the stronger that signal is, the more power you can produce. So max intent is really where you can change this connection substantially. So think about explosive movement as training your brain. And in general, humans prefer the path of least resistance. Yes, we are kind of inherently wanting to make things as easy as possible. And when it comes to explosive movement, we might not always reach our max output just because the body doesn't really want to. It's very expensive. It costs a lot to be very explosive. So something that can help is to benchmark things. For example, doing a box jump at a certain height and making sure that you can clear a certain height each time. Or if you're doing a jumping catch, trying to get the same hold at a certain height each time. And this can just help to make sure that you're recruiting and having that max intent every time. Because if you don't, you might notice that you're kind of sliding into, I'm going to use the word laziness here, but it's really, it is your body just trying to figure out, you know what, I don't want to spend this much energy doing a thing. But you do have to put a lot of mental effort with all of these exercises. So to help this mental effort, you can think about words, some cues that might help you move faster. You can think about being snappy. You can think about launching or maybe popping. Any words that help you create that feeling in the body, that can be very useful, especially on big dynamic moves or dynos. Visualization can help a ton. I've talked a lot about visualization on this podcast, and it's very useful for power training. And one type of visualization, which maybe is called like fantasy visualization, when Andy Hall, when he broke the deadlift world record, he apparently visualized his kid stuck under a car. And then he was able to bring everything into that deadlift and break the world record. Super cool. So think about some of that visualization. Maybe you can think about yourself moving as quickly as possible. Maybe you can visualize yourself having springs in your Achilles or even under your feet. You can have springs in your elbows. You can come up with any amount of things to help you. Sometimes priming can really help with becoming more explosive. Thinking of fast hands or some of these cues before you do a move or before you even get onto the wall. This can even happen in your warm-up where you're priming your brain to get used to being explosive. For some people, having a rhythm can help, especially when, for example, like a dyno, and you see people go up and down, and then they might let go on the third time they go up and down. And really, this is the brain trying to create some sort of rhythm out of this explosiveness. You can do the same in a box jump if you like, or when you're jump roping, there can be kind of a rhythm. And this is where music can play such a big role in how you perform. And I really like high, very fast beats per minute with the music that I listen to when I'm training so that I can really recruit and move as fast as possible. All right, so when should we be training power during the year? Well, I say pepper it in. You can actually use this as a seasoning. Sometimes through the year, you're just going to sprinkle some salt and pepper throughout the whole year. So that means you're just putting in a little bit of power throughout the year. And during performance seasons, maybe it's even lower. Maybe the volume dial on the power training is set to its lowest position. Otherwise, during off seasons or between a strength and a performance season, you can put all of your intention on power training and really dial that up, put all of the seasoning on there during that phase. If you go back to my episode at the beginning of 2025, I actually go over a whole phase, a whole year of what a training plan could look like. And I do talk about power training. I do break it down and I give you specific examples of how you can set up your power training so that you can really take advantage of this training for your climbing in between seasons or even in between strength and endurance seasons. So go back to that if you're interested. All right. So as a reminder, before you get into power training, you need to have some base of strength and even just body awareness. Now you can scale power training. You can be an absolute beginner and still work power. Just know that some of these bigger movements, such as depth jumps or for our fingers doing edge drops onto a hangboard, these are more advanced exercises and shouldn't be done until you have some amount of body awareness and confidence in your body. And the common analogy I think that we tend to talk about is like not being able to, like, you can't fire a cannon well out of a canoe, mostly because there's just not enough structure or stability in the system to be able to handle that kind of power. So try to think of it that way. So you want to be working on strength all year round, trying to get as strong as possible. And power is really an expression of your strength. All right, so to wrap up this episode, why should you be training power? Well, you're going to move faster. You're going to move with more confidence. You're going to be more reactive. You're going to be able to hold onto holds when you latch them. You're going to be able to hold dynamic tension when your feet cut. And you're going to build neuromuscular efficiency, meaning that you'll probably have more endurance at the end of the day after training power. The downfalls of power training is, you could easily overdo it by doing too much intensity and too much volume. So just make sure that you're resting long enough, you're feeling snappy, and that you're within your range. Make sure that you are performing the exercises as well as possible. So high quality, less quantity. All right, friends. So let me know what you think about power training. Are you going to try any of these drills? I would love to hear it. Please leave a comment. Let me know what you think about power training and how often you might do power training. All right, friends, have a good one, and I'll catch you in the next one.